evening was bright and full of laughter inside the grand mansion. Golden lights from the chandeliers reflected off the marble floors, and the sound of clinking glasses filled the air. The wealthy guests were dressed in their finest clothes, chatting about art, business, and luxury holidays. It was one of those nights where everything looked perfect, at least on the surface. Edward Hale, the host, stood at the center of it all. He was young, rich, and handsome, the kind of man who enjoyed attention and knew how to get it. People often laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny, just to stay in his good books. He liked being the center of the room, the star of his own show. Clara Dawson, on the other hand, blended into the background. She was the mansion's caretaker, a quiet woman in her late 20s with kind eyes and a calm face. She spent her days cleaning rooms, arranging flowers, and keeping the place beautiful for people who barely noticed her. Tonight, she was helping serve drinks and making sure everything went smoothly. She moved quietly, almost invisible among the shining gowns and expensive suits. The grand piano stood proudly near the corner of the hall, a glossy black instrument that no one dared to touch. It was more of a decoration than a musical piece, a symbol of wealth rather than talent. Edward had bought it last year after seeing something similar in a royal family's estate. He couldn't play a single note, but it made him look sophisticated, so it stayed there, polished and untouched. As the night went on, Edward's friends began teasing him about his lack of musical skill. One of them said with a grin, "Edward, you've got a piano that's worth a fortune, but have you ever even played it?" The group laughed and Edward smirked, pretending not to care. He took a sip of champagne and looked around for something or someone to shift the focus away from himself. That's when he noticed Clara, standing quietly near the piano, refilling glasses. She looked calm, unaware that his eyes were on her. Edward's mischievous grin returned. "You there?" he said loudly, pointing at her. The room grew quieter as everyone turned their attention toward the caretaker. Clara froze, holding a silver tray close to her chest. Edward walked a few steps closer, the playful tone in his voice carrying just enough arrogance to make people smirk. "Tell me, Clara," he said mockingly, "do you know how to play this piano?" She shook her head slightly, unsure of what to say. "No, sir," she murmured softly, her voice barely audible. Edward chuckled, turning to his friends as if to perform for them. "Ah, what a shame," he said dramatically. "Imagine if she could play. I'd probably fall in love right here." The guests laughed, some out of amusement, others out of discomfort. Clara's face turned red, but she kept her eyes down, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Then Edward, still enjoying his little moment of humor, added with a laugh, "In fact, if you can play that piano, I'll marry you." The words hung in the air, sharp and careless. The room erupted in laughter again, loud, echoing, and cruel. Even the chandelier seemed to tremble with the sound. Clara's heart sank. She wasn't angry, just deeply hurt. To them, she was nothing more than a servant, someone they could mock for entertainment. For a moment, she thought about walking away, pretending it didn't matter. But deep inside her, something stirred, a feeling she hadn't felt in years. She looked at the piano. Its polished surface reflected the golden light, almost calling to her. Memories flashed before her eyes, her father's gentle smile, his hands guiding hers over the keys when she was just a child. Music had once been her life, her dream, but that was before everything fell apart, before she had to give it all up to survive. Edward noticed her silence and smirked again. "What's wrong?" "Don't tell me you're thinking of trying," he said, his tone half joking, half challenging. His friends laughed again, waiting for her to blush and step away, but instead, Clara took a deep breath and placed the tray on a nearby table. The laughter softened as she walked toward the piano. Her steps were slow, graceful, and calm. Edward frowned slightly, realizing she wasn't joking. The crowd watched in confusion and curiosity. What was this caretaker doing? Clara reached the piano and gently ran her fingers across the keys, feeling the smooth ivory surface beneath her touch. Her heart raced, but her face stayed calm. The room fell completely silent now. No laughter, no whispers, just the faint hum of the chandeliers above. Edward stood frozen, unsure of what to expect. A moment ago, he was the one in control, but now the attention had shifted. All eyes were on her. The woman he had mocked was about to do something none of them could predict. She glanced once at Edward, her eyes steady and unreadable. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a clever line or a smirk ready. Something about her calmness made him uneasy. Then, without a word, Clara pulled out the piano bench and sat down. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The world around her seemed to disappear. The guests, the chandeliers, the laughter, all gone. It was just her and the piano, like it used to be. And as her fingers touched the first note, the story truly began to change. The room was so quiet that even the soft ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard. Every guest stood still, holding their breath. Clara's fingers hovered over the piano keys, and her heart was beating fast. Not out of fear, but something stronger. It was as if all the laughter and mockery had disappeared, and the world had shrunk down to this one moment between her and the piano. Edward Hale stood a few steps away, arms crossed, still wearing his proud half-smile, though it had begun to fade. He didn't believe she could play. To him, this was just a moment of amusement, a servant trying to impress her masters. But inside, Clara was not thinking about impressing anyone. She was thinking about her father, about his rough, warm hands guiding hers on an old second-hand piano many years ago. She remembered how he would always say, "Music doesn't need an audience, Clara. It only needs your heart." Her hands began to move. The first few notes were soft, almost hesitant, but they carried emotion, like a whisper that asked the room to listen. The melody slowly took shape, a tender tune filled with sadness and beauty. The guests exchanged confused glances. No one expected this. The woman they had all ignored and mocked now filled the hall with something that felt almost magical. The laughter that had once echoed through the room was gone, replaced by a gentle wave of sound that wrapped around everyone present. The piano keys seemed alive under her touch, responding to her emotion. Her fingers moved faster now, confident, graceful, and sure. It was as if the music had been sleeping inside her for years, waiting for this one moment to wake up. Edward's smirk disappeared completely. His eyes widened slightly as he watched her. The soft golden light from the chandeliers reflected off the piano, creating a dreamlike glow around Clara. Her head tilted slightly as she played, lost in the rhythm, her expression calm yet full of feeling. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story without words. The people in the room began to feel something they couldn't explain. One of Edward's friends, who had laughed the loudest before, now stood with his mouth half open. A woman in a silver gown wiped a tear from her eye, pretending to fix her makeup. Even the servants had stopped working, their eyes glued to Clara, as if they were seeing her for the first time. The melody changed, growing stronger, deeper. Every note carried power, but not anger. There was pride in it, quiet and steady. It was the sound of a heart that had been hurt, but never broken. It was the music of someone who had lost everything, yet still had the courage to stand tall. As the song reached its highest point, Clara's body seemed to move with the rhythm. She wasn't thinking. She was feeling. Her hands danced over the keys, her eyes half closed, her lips pressed together in focus. The whole hall seemed to breathe with her music. For a moment, even the chandelier lights flickered softly, as if bowing to her tune. Edward couldn't look away. His chest felt heavy, a strange mix of admiration and guilt rising inside him. He remembered how carelessly he had spoken, how easily he had laughed at someone without knowing who she really was. He had thought he was the one in control, but now, standing there among his silent guests, he felt small. The music had turned the tables. He was no longer the host. He was the audience. Clara's thoughts, meanwhile, were far away. She was no longer in the grand mansion. In her mind, she was a little girl again, sitting, sitting beside her father on a broken piano bench, playing for the joy of it. She remembered her mother smiling from the kitchen, humming along. She remembered dreams of performing on real stages, of traveling the world. But life had been cruel. When her father died and her mother fell ill, the dream had faded. She had sold her piano to pay hospital bills. That day, she promised herself she'd never play again. It hurt too much. Yet here she was. Her fingers were proving her wrong. The music she thought she had buried forever was alive. It was pouring out of her like light through a cracked window. Every note was a piece of her soul returning home. When the final note rang out, it hung in the air for a few seconds. Soft, fading, but full of meaning. Clara lifted her hands slowly from the keys. Silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, someone began to clap. Just one pair of hands at first, hesitant and unsure. But soon the sound grew louder as others joined in. The hall filled with applause, not polite or forced, but real. People clapped with tears in their eyes, whispering to one another in disbelief. Edward stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Clara. For once, he didn't have anything clever to say. His voice was softer when he finally spoke. "Clara, how did you—" He stopped himself. Words didn't fit here. Clara simply stood up, smoothing her apron, her expression calm, but her eyes bright with emotion. "You said if I could play," she said quietly, "you'd marry me." Her tone wasn't angry. It was almost kind. "But I don't think you even understand what that means." The guests laughed softly again, but not in mockery this time. It was the kind of laughter that comes from awe. Edward didn't reply. He could only stare at her, still lost in the music that echoed inside his mind. As Clara walked away from the piano, her steps were light. For the first time in years, she felt strong, not because she had proven anything to Edward, but because she had found herself again. The applause faded slowly, but the echo of the music still filled the grand hall. Clara stood beside the piano, her hands trembling slightly. For a long time, she couldn't move. The sound of the final note seemed to still live in her chest, as if her heart had become part of the melody itself. She had played without thinking, not to prove anyone wrong, not to impress the guests, but because, for the first time in years, she had felt alive. Edward Hale, the man who had mocked her, was still staring in disbelief. His lips were slightly parted, his face pale under the warm light. He had expected a few random notes, maybe a clumsy attempt that would make his friends laugh again. Instead, he had witnessed something rare, something that money could never buy. The silence between them was heavy, yet beautiful. Clara turned away from the piano, her eyes lowering as she tried to calm her breathing. Around her, the guests whispered softly. Where did she learn that? Who is she really? That was incredible. Their words reached her, but she didn't respond. Compliments meant nothing to her anymore. They were like echoes bouncing off walls that didn't need to be heard. She walked toward the side of the hall where the other servants stood frozen. They looked at her differently now, not as one of them who cleaned floors or carried trays, but as someone who had just reminded everyone in that room what real grace looked like. One of the maids, Anna, gave her a small smile. Clara nodded back quietly. But inside, her emotions were spinning. The music had awakened memories she had tried to bury long ago. She remembered being a little girl in a small town, sitting at an old upright piano that her father had bought second-hand from a school auction. It was scratched, a few keys were chipped, and sometimes it went out of tune. But to her, it was magic. Her father, a schoolteacher with gentle eyes, had taught her how to play. Every evening, after finishing his work, he would sit beside her and guide her hands over the keys. Don't rush, he would say softly. Each note is a word, Clara. Make them speak. Those evenings were the happiest of her life. The little house was always full of music, bright, simple melodies that made even her tired mother smile from the kitchen. Clara used to dream of becoming a concert pianist one day. Her teachers told her she had real talent, and one even helped her apply for a scholarship to a music conservatory. When the acceptance letter arrived, she had cried from joy. But life doesn't always follow dreams. Before she could leave for the city, her mother fell seriously ill. The hospital bills were too high, and her father had to take extra work. Clara stayed home to help. Days turned into months, and months into years. When her mother finally passed away, her father's health began to fail too. She sold the piano to pay for medicine. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. The day the movers took it away, she had stood by the door, trying not to cry. Her father had simply hugged her and said, "You have the gift inside you, my dear. They can take the piano, but not your music." When he died 2 years later, Clara stopped playing completely. The world felt empty without him. She took whatever work she could find, cleaning, cooking, caretaking, anything to survive. Music became a wound she refused to touch. Until tonight. As she stood in the grand hall, the memories played in her mind like a film. Her father's smile, the sound of laughter, the warm light of their little home. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked to him away quickly. This was not the time to break down. Edward's voice broke the silence. "Clara," he said softly, stepping closer. She didn't look at him. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I didn't know you could play like that." She gave a faint smile, still looking at the floor. "You didn't ask," she replied. Her tone wasn't rude, just honest. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, Edward Hale, the man who always had something clever to say, was speechless. Clara turned slightly toward him. "You shouldn't mock people, sir," she said gently. "You never know what they've been through, or what they can do." Her words hit him harder than any insult could have. There was no anger in her voice, only truth. It made him feel small. Around them, the guests pretended to busy themselves, but they were listening. No one laughed now. The room that once roared with arrogance had become humble, silent, and still. Edward lowered his eyes, feeling a rare sting of shame. He wanted to apologize, but the words tangled in his throat. Clara didn't wait for a response. She simply gave a small nod and started walking away, leaving him standing beside the piano he once used as decoration, the same piano she had just brought to life. As she walked through the hall, the guests parted quietly to let her pass. Some looked down, embarrassed by their earlier laughter. Others watched her with quiet respect. For the first time, Clara wasn't invisible. When she reached the corridor outside, she stopped for a moment. The sound of the piano still echoed faintly in her ears. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling its rhythm, steady, alive, and full of something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer. "You were right, Papa. The gift never leaves." And with that, she smiled, not for anyone else, but for herself. Inside that mansion full of wealth and pride, Claire's, had reminded everyone, especially herself, that true worth doesn't come from status, but from what lives quietly inside the soul. Clara walked through the long hallway of the mansion, her steps echoing softly against the marble floor. The noise from the party had faded behind her. The music she had played still lingered in her mind like a dream that refused to end. Every note was alive inside her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How her hands, after so many silent years, had moved so easily over the keys. It felt like her father had been there with her, guiding her fingers again, whispering, "Don't be afraid, my little pianist." She stopped beside one of the tall windows. Outside, the night was quiet, the garden bathed in silver moonlight. For a moment, she rested her forehead against the cool glass, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had no idea what the guests thought of her now, and honestly, she didn't care. For the first time in a long while, she felt whole, like she had finally met the person she used to be. Her mind drifted back to her childhood again. She could see her small town clearly. The narrow streets lined with flower pots, the smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the lane, the old piano shop that always displayed instruments she couldn't afford to touch. She remembered her father sitting by the window, reading music sheets under a dim lamp. He had always believed in her more than she believed in herself. "You have something special, Clara," he used to say, smiling through his tired eyes. "When you play, you make people feel things they didn't know they could feel." She used to laugh at that. Back then, she didn't understand what he meant, but tonight, she did. When she played in that hall, surrounded by people who had laughed at her, she had seen the change in their eyes. The pride, the noise, the arrogance, all had vanished when the music began. For a few minutes, they had felt something real. Even Edward Hale, with his perfect smile and expensive suit, had looked human, lost, almost soft. Clara smiled faintly at the thought, not out of victory, but out of quiet satisfaction. Her father had been right all along. Music didn't need fame or money. It only needed truth. She closed her eyes, remembering one evening long ago. She must have been 16. It was raining heavily outside, and her mother was coughing in the next room. Her father had sat beside her at the piano, trying to teach her a difficult piece. She was frustrated, her fingers slipping over the keys. "I can't do it," she had said angrily, her eyes filling with tears. Her father had laughed softly and placed his hand over hers. "You can," he said. "You just don't believe it yet." Then he had guided her hand, playing the melody slowly with her until it sounded right. When the song ended, he said, "One day, when you play in front of others, remember, play like no one's watching. Play for yourself." Those words had stayed buried in her heart for years. But tonight, when Edward mocked her, when the room laughed, those very words had come back. They had given her the courage to sit down and play. She hadn't played for them. She had played for herself and for her father. Clara took a deep breath and continued walking down the hall. She entered the small staff room where she usually kept her things. The room was plain but clean. A single wooden table, a kettle, and a few chairs. On the wall hung a photo of the mansion's gardens from years ago, before she started working there. She sat down and let herself finally breathe. Her hands still tingled from the piano keys. She rubbed them gently, smiling at the memory of how natural it had felt. For so long she had believed that her gift was gone, that it had faded with time and pain. But it hadn't. It had only been waiting, quietly, for the right moment to return. Meanwhile, upstairs, Edward Hale stood alone near the piano. The guests had moved on to, other rooms, trying to act normal again, but the atmosphere had changed. The laughter was quieter now, the music from the speakers dull compared to the real melody they had just heard. Edward ran his fingers over the piano keys, pressing one softly. The sound was flat, lifeless. He whispered to himself, "How did she do it?" He had grown up with everything money could buy. Tutors, parties, fine art. Yet he had never seen anything as powerful as what he had just witnessed. That woman, a caretaker, had managed to move a room full of rich people to silence. She had shown him something no one ever had. Humility. Back in the staff room, Clara looked out the small window again. She could see the edge of the garden and the stars scattered across the sky. She thought of her father again and smiled. "I played again, Papa," she whispered. "You'd be proud." Her eyes watered, but this time the tears weren't from sadness. They were from relief. The pain of losing her music was finally gone. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. She turned, expecting maybe one of the maids, but when the door opened, it was Edward. He looked different, quieter, unsure. He hesitated at the doorway. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said softly. Clara nodded politely but said nothing. He stepped in slowly. I wanted to thank you. For the music. There was a pause. She could see he was struggling for words, maybe even regret. I didn't realize, he continued, that you were so talented. I shouldn't have. Clara stopped him gently. It's all right, sir, she said. Sometimes it takes silence to hear what matters. Her words struck him again, and for the first time, he smiled. Not the proud, polished smile he gave his guests, but a real, human one. He nodded slowly and left, leaving Clara alone once more. She watched the door close and let out a soft sigh. The echoes of her past had finally settled. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It felt peaceful. Edward couldn't sleep that night. Long after the guests had left, the mansion stood quiet. The servants had cleaned up the glasses, put away the food, and gone to their rooms. But Edward remained awake in the large, empty hall, sitting in front of the same piano that had changed everything. He ran his fingers gently over the keys, pressing one or two softly, but nothing sounded right. The music that Clara had played still echoed in his head. No matter how many times he replayed it in his memory, he couldn't understand how something so beautiful had come from someone he barely noticed before that night. He leaned back in his chair, his reflection visible on the shiny surface of the piano. For the first time, he didn't like what he saw. Not the expensive suit, not the confident expression, not the man who thought he owned the world. The truth stung him. He had spent years collecting things, cars, paintings, rare wines, and a grand piano, thinking they made him special. But now he realized none of those things could give him what Clara had shown him in a few minutes of music. Real soul. He closed his eyes and remembered her calm face as she played. There was no pride, no fear, just peace. It was like she was part of the music itself. The more he thought about it, the worse he felt about his words. If you can play that piano, I'll marry you. He had said it as a joke, something to make people laugh, but it wasn't funny anymore. It was cruel. He had used someone's dignity for entertainment. Edward had always been admired by people, but now he wondered if they truly respected him, or just his money. No one in that room had stopped him when he mocked Clara. They had all laughed. He felt disgusted, not with them, but with himself. As the night stretched on, he stood and walked toward the big glass windows that overlooked the garden. The moonlight spilled across the flowers, and he could faintly see the shadow of the small staff building where Clara stayed. He thought about her, the way she walked away from the piano, the way she spoke to him without fear. She hadn't shouted or insulted him. She had simply told the truth, and it had cut deeper than any anger could. He wondered what her life was like. How could someone who worked as a caretaker play like a concert pianist? What had brought her here? What had she lost to end up cleaning rooms in a mansion like his? He realized how little he knew about people who worked for him, their stories, their struggles, their dreams. When dawn began to break, Edward was still awake. He went to the kitchen for coffee, where a few servants were already starting their morning duties. They looked surprised to see him so early. "Good morning, sir," one of them said. He nodded absent-mindedly and glanced around. "Is Clara here?" The maid nodded. "She's out in the garden, sir. She starts early." Edward thanked her and walked outside. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of wet grass. He spotted Clara near the fountain, trimming the rose bushes. Her hair was tied back, and the soft sunlight made her look almost glowing. For a moment he hesitated. Then he walked toward her. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, surprised to see him dressed casually. No suit, no arrogance, just a simple shirt and tired eyes. "Good morning," she said politely. "Good morning," he replied. There was a pause. He looked around the garden, then bowed at her. "You keep this place beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you, sir," she answered. "It's peaceful here." He nodded. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was thoughtful. Finally, he spoke again. "About last night, I owe you an apology. What I said was wrong. I shouldn't have mocked you." Clara looked at him, her expression calm. "You don't need to apologize, sir," she said softly. "It's over now." "No," Edward said firmly. "It's not over. You made me realize something important." She tilted her head slightly, curious but cautious. He continued, "I thought having money made me powerful. I thought owning beautiful things made me cultured. But last night, you showed me something I've never had. Real grace. When you played, you didn't just play music. You made the whole room feel something. You made me feel something I can't describe." Clara looked down, embarrassed. "I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson, sir. I just played what I felt." Edward smiled faintly. That's exactly why it mattered. There was a quiet moment between them. The fountain splashed softly in the background, and birds began to sing in the trees. Edward finally said, "Would you tell me about your music? How did you learn? Who taught you?" Clara hesitated. Her instinct was to stay silent, to keep her past private. But something about his tone, gentle, sincere, made her believe he truly wanted to know. So she told him, simply and honestly. She spoke of her father, the old piano, the dreams that had faded, and how life had forced her to stop playing. Edward listened carefully, not interrupting once. When she finished, he sighed deeply. "You've lived more than most of us ever will," he said quietly. "And yet, you carry no bitterness. That's rare." Clara smiled softly. "Bitterness is heavy," she said. "Music helped me let it go." Edward nodded slowly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he admired someone not for what they owned, but for who they were. As he walked back toward the mansion, the morning sun warmed the marble steps beneath his feet. He felt different, lighter, humbled, awake. For the first time, Edward Hale realized that true wealth wasn't measured in gold, art, or property. It was measured in how deeply a person could feel and how much beauty they could create from pain. And that lesson had come, not from another millionaire, but from the quiet caretaker who had played like a genius. The next few days in the mansion felt strangely different. The usual loud laughter, gossip, and noise seemed quieter now. Even the servants noticed it. Edward Hale, once known for his sharp voice and commanding presence, now walked the halls in silence, his thoughts far away. He had begun seeing things differently. The same marble floors, the chandeliers, the art, everything looked the same, yet it all felt empty. Every time he passed the piano, he paused. He couldn't help it. The memory of Clara playing that night came back to him over and over again. Her calm face, her graceful hands, the way her music had silenced a room full of people. It haunted him, but in a beautiful way. He had spent most of his life thinking wealth was everything. His friends admired him for his riches, not for his heart. But Clara, without meaning to, had shown him something that money could never buy: honesty, passion, and peace. One afternoon, Edward found himself standing near the garden again, watching Clara from a distance. She was watering the plants, her sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled into a simple bun. There was no pride in her movements, only quiet care. She looked content with the simplest things: sunlight, flowers, and silence. He walked toward her, and when she noticed him, she straightened up politely. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "Clara," he began, "I wanted to ask you something." She looked at him curiously. He hesitated before speaking. "Why do you work here? You have such talent. You could be performing in concert halls, teaching, creating music, not cleaning my house." Clara smiled faintly. "Because life doesn't always go the way we dream it, sir," she said softly. "Sometimes the road changes before we're ready." He could hear the sadness behind her calm tone. "But you deserve better," he said quietly. She shook her head gently. I used to think that way too. But I've learned that better isn't always about money or fame. Sometimes it's about peace. Her words sank deep into him. He had spent years chasing success, but peace was something he had never truly known. He sat down on a garden bench and she joined him, wiping her hands with a cloth. The sound of birds filled the silence between them. After a long pause, he asked softly, "Will you tell me about your life? I mean, before this place?" Clara looked thoughtful, then nodded slowly. "If you really want to know." And so she told him. She told him about the small town where she grew up, how her father was a music teacher who worked tirelessly to support the family, how her mother was kind and always humming around the house. She spoke about learning piano as a child, how her fingers used to slip on the keys, but her father would always encourage her to try again. Then she told him about the conservatory letter, how she was accepted to study music, how she had cried with joy, believing her life was about to change. But before she could leave, her mother became sick. The hospital bills drained everything they had. Her father sold his instruments, and she gave up her scholarship to care for her mother. Edward listened without interrupting, his face serious. He had never heard a story like this from someone he knew personally. For him, hardship had always been something distant, something that happened to others. When my mother died, Clara continued quietly, my father grew weak. He tried to hide it from me, but I could see it. He was heartbroken. We had nothing left. I sold our piano to pay for his medicine. That was the hardest day of my life. Her voice cracked a little, but she smiled softly through it. He told me not to cry. He said the piano was just wood and keys, that the real music lived inside me. He was right. But after he passed away, I couldn't bring myself to play again. It hurt too much. Edward's throat tightened as he listened. He couldn't imagine that kind of loss. Giving up dreams, family, and passion, yet still standing with such quiet strength. Clara, he said gently, you've lived through so much, and yet you're still kind. How? She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because anger doesn't fix anything, sir. It only steals your peace. My father used to say that pain makes the best music if you don't let it break you. He nodded slowly, deeply moved. He had never met anyone like her. Someone who carried so much pain and yet radiated so much light. I wish I could go back and change that night, he said quietly. The way I spoke to you, the way I acted. I was arrogant. Clara smiled gently. You don't need to. That night brought something good too, didn't it? Edward looked at her, puzzled. It made you listen, she said simply. He couldn't help but smile. She was right. That night had opened his eyes in ways he couldn't explain. After a few minutes of silence, Clara stood and picked up her watering can. I should get back to work, she said softly. Edward rose too. Clara, one more thing, he said. You said your father believed the music lives inside you. Maybe it's time the world hears it again. She looked at him, her eyes uncertain but warm. Maybe, she said quietly. He watched her walk away through the garden, sunlight falling gently on her shoulders. In that moment, Edward made a silent promise, not to mock, not to pity, but to help her rediscover what she had lost. That evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, Edward sat once again at the piano. He pressed a few keys, but his touch was clumsy. He smiled faintly. I have much to learn, he murmured. He looked toward the window, where Clara's shadow moved in the fading light, and whispered, and I think I know who my teacher will be. The next morning was quiet in the mansion. A thin fog floated over the gardens, and the air smelled of dew and roses. Edward Hale sat alone in his study, staring out the tall windows. He hadn't slept much again. His mind kept returning to Clara's words. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who praised him, but none of them had ever made him think. No one had ever spoken to him with such honesty. Clara's story had humbled him in ways he didn't expect. He had seen her strength, her grace, and her peace, and he realized how lost he had been. For the first time, Edward wanted to do something that wasn't about himself. He stood up and walked out to the garden where he knew he would find her. As always, she was already working, trimming the rose bushes, her face calm, her movements graceful. When she saw him approach, she straightened up politely. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. "Clara," he began, "do you have a moment?" She nodded, then spoke. Then Edward took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about everything you told me," he said quietly. "About your father, your music, your life. I can't stop thinking about how strong you are, how you still smile after everything." Clara looked down, her fingers nervously folding the edge of her apron. "Strength isn't something you're born with," she said softly. "It's something life forces you to learn." Edward nodded slowly. "That's true, and I've realized I've spent my life learning nothing." Clara looked at him surprised. "That's not true," she said kindly. He gave a small smile. "It is. I learned how to make money, how to host parties, how to look important, but not how to live. Last week, if someone had asked me what I valued most, I would have said my house, my cars, my reputation. But now," he paused, looking at her. "Now I think I'd say peace. The kind you have." Clara smiled faintly, touched by his honesty. "Peace doesn't come from what we have," she said. "It comes from what we forgive, especially ourselves." Her words hit him hard. He took a deep breath and looked at her seriously. "Then I have something to ask your forgiveness for." She looked at him curiously. He continued. "That night, I embarrassed you in front of everyone. I mocked you. I made you feel small. I've never regretted anything more in my life." Clara was silent for a moment. The garden breeze lifted a few strands of her hair, and she looked down, lost in thought. "You didn't know me then," she said softly. "And I didn't know you. Maybe that night had to happen, for both of us to learn something." He frowned slightly. "You're still being too kind. I was cruel." She shook her head gently. "You were human." Her words surprised him. "Human," he repeated. "Yes," she said with a small smile. "We all make mistakes, especially when we think we're above others. Life has a way of reminding us that we're all equal. Sometimes the reminder hurts, but it's necessary." Edward stared at her, his heart heavy but lighter than before. "You really believe that?" She nodded. "I do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then let me at least do one thing right. Let me make it up to you." Clara smiled. "You don't owe me anything, sir." He shook his head. "Maybe not, but I want to do something. Not because I owe you, but because you deserve it." She looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then spoke slowly. "I want you to play again. Not just for me, or for the people here, but for yourself. You said music lives inside you, and I believe that. Let it out again. Don't hide it anymore." Clara's eyes softened, but there was hesitation in them too. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. "I can't just walk onto a stage." "I know," Edward said. "But what if I helped you? I could host a small charity concert here at the mansion. You could play. It doesn't have to be big. Just a few people, maybe for a good cause, like funding a music school for children who can't afford instruments." Clara stared at him, surprised. "You'd do that?" He nodded. "I want to. Not to show off, but because I think it's the right thing to do, and because I think people deserve to hear you." Tears filled her eyes. but she blinked them away quickly. You really think I could do that? I don't think, he said softly. I know. For the first time she smiled. Not her quiet, polite smile, but a real one that lit up her face. All right, she said finally. But on one condition. What's that? He asked. That it's not about me, she said. If we do this, it should be for something good. For the children, like you said. For those who dream but can't afford to chase it. Edward smiled. Then it settled. They both stood, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Not as a master and caretaker, but as two people who understood each other. Later that day, Edward called his assistant and began planning the event. He didn't care what society would say or whether people would find it strange. For the first time in years, he felt proud, not of his money, but of his purpose. Clara, meanwhile, returned to her small room that evening with a strange mixture of fear and excitement. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror and whispered to herself, Papa, I'm going to play again. And this time, for others. In another part of the mansion, Edward looked out the window at the stars, feeling something new in his heart. Not guilt, not pride, but redemption. A week later, the mansion looked different. The same grand hall that had once echoed with laughter and arrogance was now filled with something gentler. Purpose. Flowers lined the staircase, candles flickered on every table, and a small stage had been set near the grand piano that had changed everything. Edward Hale had kept his word. He had organized a charity concert to raise money for a local music school, a place that would help poor children learn instruments, just like Clara's father had once dreamed for her. The guest list wasn't filled with shallow socialites this time. It was smaller, quieter, filled with people who cared about the cause. Edward stood near the entrance, greeting each person as they came in. He was nervous, not because of the event, but because of what it meant. This night wasn't about showing wealth or status. It was about healing. For him, for Clara, and for the music that had brought them together. Clara, meanwhile, stood backstage, dressed in a simple pale blue gown that Edward had insisted on gifting her. She had refused at first, saying it was too much, but he had told her gently, You're not a servant tonight, Clara. You're the heart of this evening. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the fabric, but her eyes were calm. She looked at the piano through the thin curtain and smiled softly. Papa, she thought, this is for you. When the lights dimmed, Edward walked onto the stage to welcome everyone. Good evening, he began. His voice was clear but humble. Thank you all for being here tonight. This event is not about me or this mansion. It's about music, the language that connects hearts. And tonight, you'll hear that language spoken by someone whose gift reminds us what it means to truly feel. He paused, looking toward Clara with a gentle smile. Please welcome Clara Dawson. Applause filled the room, warm and genuine. Clara stepped out slowly, her heart pounding. For a moment she felt that same fear she had felt the night Edward mocked her, all those eyes watching. But then she took a deep breath and sat down at the piano. The room went silent. She touched the keys lightly, her fingers remembering every curve, every distance, and then she began to play. This time, the melody was different, bright, hopeful, and full of life. It was like sunlight pouring through windows after a long winter. Her music carried every emotion she had ever felt, pain, love, loss, peace, and wove them into something beautiful. The guests were mesmerized. Some closed their eyes, some held hands, others simply stared in awe. Even the servants who stood in the back couldn't hold back their tears. It wasn't just a performance. It was a story told through sound. Edward stood at the side of the stage, his eyes never leaving her. Each note felt like a step toward redemption. Not only for him, but for everyone who had ever forgotten what truly mattered. He realized then that Clara had done something extraordinary. She hadn't just forgiven him, she had changed him. When the last note faded, the room erupted in applause, louder than any thing the mansion had ever heard. People stood, clapping with all their hearts. Clara stood slowly, bowing her head in gratitude. She looked up and met Edward's eyes. He smiled, proud and deeply moved. After the concert, people came to thank her, shake her hand, and tell her how moved they were. But Clara wasn't thinking about fame or praise. All she felt was peace. Deep, pure peace. Later, when the guests had begun to leave, Edward walked onto the stage where she still stood by the piano. The room was quiet now, lit only by the soft glow of candles. "That was beautiful," he said softly. Clara smiled. "It felt right," she replied. "I think my father would have been proud." Edward nodded. "I'm sure he would." There was a long pause between them. They stood in silence, the only sound coming from the faint crackle of the candles. Then Edward took a step closer. "Clara," he began, his voice gentle. "Do you remember what I said the night I mocked you?" Clara gave a small smile. "I remember every word, sir." He looked down for a moment, then met her eyes again. "I said if you could play that piano, I'd marry you." He gave a soft laugh full of regret. Back then it was a joke, a cruel one. But tonight, he took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly. "Tonight, I mean it." Clara froze, her eyes widening. He continued quietly. "Not because you played like a genius, but because you've shown me what real beauty, kindness, and strength look like. You've changed me, Clara, and I don't ever want to go back to who I was before I met you." The room was silent. The flickering candlelight reflected in her eyes as she looked at him. "Edward," she said softly, "you don't need to do this." He shook his head. "I'm not doing it out of guilt. I'm doing it because I finally see what love really is. Not luxury or power, but respect, truth, and peace. You taught me that." For a moment, Clara couldn't speak. Her heart was full of emotion, gratitude, and disbelief. She smiled gently and said, "I don't know what the future holds, Edward, but I know one thing. Music brought us here for a reason." He nodded. "Then let's find out what that reason is. Together." They stood there in the quiet hall, surrounded by the soft light of candles and the faint scent of roses. The same piano that had once been a symbol of mockery was now a symbol of love and forgiveness. As the night came to an end, the two of them sat side by side at the piano. Clara placed her hands on the keys, and Edward placed his beside hers. Together they played a simple tune, nothing grand, nothing perfect, but honest and full of heart. Outside, the stars shone brighter than ever, as if the heavens themselves were listening. And somewhere in that gentle night, Clara's father would have smiled, because his daughter had not only found her music again, but also someone who finally understood its meaning.